Acts chapter 7 is where we're going to be starting, the very end of Acts chapter 7. That's where we got to pretty much last week. Looked at the speech of Stephen, the character of Stephen, I guess. We looked at his speech, kind of broke it down a little bit. It's a very long speech, one of the longest that we'll find, uninterrupted at least, until he got to the very end, or what turned out to be the end. I don't know if he was done talking or not, but once he said the things that he said in the last, or in verses 51 through 53, that was all that he was given the chance to say because of the reaction of his audience. And what he said there was, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who had announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered, you who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." And what we read next is their reaction. "Now when they heard these things, they were enraged," the ESV says. Some of the versions say cut to the heart. "And they ground their teeth at him. But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, Behold, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul." So, this is the third time that we read about an effect like this from a speech or a sermon. We saw it on the day of Pentecost with Peter's sermon there. They were pricked in their heart. They asked, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" And then they repented and obeyed what Peter said to do. Then in chapter 5, the apostles are before the council. They heard Peter's speech. They were cut to the heart. They wanted to kill them. But then they were narrowly dissuaded from doing that by Gamaliel. On this occasion, they heard Stephen's speech. They were cut to the heart. They cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, cast him out of the city, and killed him. So a progression there almost. They would have killed Peter and the other apostles earlier, but they were convinced not to do that. On this occasion, Gamaliel's voice never showed up, apparently. We don't know why. Maybe he wasn't there. But this time, they not only wanted to kill the speaker, but they did kill him, or began to kill him here by stoning him. The pictures that Luke paints here is pretty vivid. Not only grinding their teeth at him, but also crying out with a loud... I mean, this is pretty severe stuff. They cried out with a loud voice. Anybody want to paraphrase crying out with a loud voice? Screaming. That's what I would call it, screaming. I mean, you're either speaking with a normal volume voice, or you're speaking with a loud voice or making a sound with a loud voice, and we would normally call that screaming, yelling, which is a very strange reaction to us anyway, sounds like, to something like this. They stopped their ears. How do you stop your ears? Don't you wish you could stop your ears sometimes? Yeah, you could either quit listening, you could figuratively stop making them hear, or you could literally stop them, like you would do a drain. You know, you stop it. Stop the water going through. Like a child, that's what I picture, a child like this. I can't hear you. Except they're screaming, they're yelling, and stopping their ears, and they rush at him. Pretty scary. Cast him out of the city. So they grab him, they drag him out of the city. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And stoned him. The only thing missing is going before the Roman governor. On this occasion, for whatever reason, they seem to have gotten away with doing this. Their emotions got ahead of them. But before the end of this whole situation, Stephen sees, he looks up, full of the Holy Spirit. He looks up into heaven, the heavens, and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God. It's a very interesting picture, again, because, other places Jesus is depicted as sitting at the right hand of God, but here he's standing at the right hand of God. Maybe that makes no difference. Maybe there's no meaning to that whatsoever. Of course, scholars or commentators have suggested some reasons why he may be pictured as standing here instead of sitting. But I think the point is, he sees Jesus there at the right hand of God, and he says so. And that's very similar to something Jesus said in his own trial. If you remember, you'll see the Son of Man standing or be at the right hand of the glory of God or whatever, to loosely paraphrase. And that's whenever they had a similar reaction, it seems, to what they did here, stopping their ears and crying out, tearing their garments, Now Stephen says, I see exactly what he once said that you would see. Yeah, Joe?
Well, this also reminds me of,
Yeah.
he had an anchor that he held on to.
He was in a very, very ugly place right here. He doesn't seem to have anybody around him. He's just there all alone. And this is what's happening around him. These hateful, ugly people acting like this, and they are taking him to kill him. No friends to help him. No, nothing around him to give him any sort of positive view or point of view of this until this vision or whatever. And it's would have helped him to get through this at least peacefully as somebody could. He sees this, and there's no indication that he was supposed to say that he saw it. He just saw it for his own good, I think, anyway. But perfectly in character for him, he just says what he saw. He says that he sees it because he does. Not because God told him to tell, but because he saw it. So he says he saw it. I see, just like he told them the truth before, he's telling them the truth now. I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. I don't know if he had any anticipation that they would, a way that they would react to that, good or bad, but he just saw it, so he said it. But this is when they seem to be even more outraged, and when they finally did cast him out of the city to stone him. And we also meet a new character here that is going to be a very major character, a big player for the cause of Christ, ironically. We meet him here for the first time, a young man named Saul. And the reason that we know that this is Saul of Tarsus, who would later become the Apostle Paul, is because he says so. Later in chapter 22, verse 20, he says, he identifies himself as the one that watched all the coats or whatever, however we want to put it. They put their garments down at the feet of a young man named Saul, which implies that he had a significant role, more so than implying that he didn't have a significant role, like, well, he was just the coat watcher, he wasn't that big a deal. I was just the getaway driver or whatever. It wasn't like that. But apparently this would imply the opposite, that he must have had a significant part to play to some extent. And it's not over yet. We might think it would be over. But even further, we see Stephen's spirit and how his spirit was so much like imitating Jesus. It says, as they were stoning Stephen, which is I don't even think we can imagine how brutal and awful that would be. I mean, we might be just assume, well, of course it's awful, but if we were actually to see it happen, we would probably all, our whatever we ate that day would be out on the ground somewhere because of how horrendous it would be to witness it. But as they were doing that, he calls out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. Both of the things he said there are reminiscent of Jesus' words on the cross. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Stephen, he imitates those very things that Jesus said. Maybe that was a coincidence. Maybe Stephen was somewhere where he heard about that, or maybe heard it from the Lord's mouth. I don't know. But at any rate, he says two things that are very similar to that, which is very incredible. Yep.
This is really more of an informational trying to figure out. So on a stoning, I understand what they do. They take stones, but there's got to be something that keeps that person from getting up and just running. So do they bind their legs and hands so they can't get away? I don't know. I'm just.
That's a good point.
And if we were to say we're going to go out and stone somebody today, and we all go out there to grab a stone, we're going to be hunting for a while because there's not enough stones out there to throw at people that really hurt. So
Yeah.
do they create this cachet of stones in a big pile? We all go out and grab one and throw. I mean, I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different methods that have been recorded that they did. One of them is that they had a very large one that they actually put on top of them. That was one way, and then maybe they did more, after that. But beyond that, there, like you said, there had to have been a way to detain them a little bit because anybody's going to run, and at least for a little bit, try. But maybe they had a way of a place where they did it where they couldn't run, or if they're in the, I don't know. They obviously would have had stones that were sufficient to do the job, and it's just horrendous to think about. But, the thing that's overlooked this whole time, not overlooked, but just kind of not mentioned by Luke, is the fact that they didn't have the legal authority to do that themselves in this way. It's been said that profaning the temple was like the only thing that they were allowed to pronounce the death penalty, but they weren't allowed to just carry it out like this in a heat of passion, doing it like this. And they say, people have asked the question, this is really not that realistic, because how would they just get away with this? Well, we're talking about a corruption up and down the board. So there's all kinds of corruption already. So it's not that inconceivable that they could have gotten away with this, because Roman soldiers or guards or officials could have just looked the other way. Or maybe they didn't get away with it. For all we know, they suffered some sort of consequence for doing this. It's just not said. So just because Luke doesn't say they didn't have the right to do that and they paid for it later by the Roman government, they really brought the hammer down on them, doesn't mean that they didn't do that. It just means that it's not in the scope of what Luke is recording here. So Stephen goes down in history as the first recorded Christian martyr anyway. And his example lives on just as he's imitating Jesus, because as amazed as we are at Jesus on the cross being able to say some of the things he said, Stephen shows that it is possible for a mere man to follow in at least a little bit in his steps, to imitate him, even in such a horrendous moment as that, when, again, he was being killed for doing nothing but what God wanted him to do. Mm-hmm.
It was like the war had begun with Stephen.
Yeah. If there was any hesitation on anybody's part to strike against this group, the floodgates seem to have opened. And we know, they were careful at first, and like Gamaliel said about the apostles, would have applied to any of the movement, not just the seeming leaders of the movement, but any people like Stephen even, that they should have thought twice, because like he said, if it's from God, nothing you're going to do, nothing you can do will stop it. If it's not from God, you don't have to stop it, because God will stop it. So they should have kept listening to that advice, but for whatever reason, they're not listening. They stopped taking that advice. They did take that advice, but now they're not. And like Joe said, what happened from this is the persecution escalates very rapidly. Oops. And the first sentence of verse 1 in chapter 8 is one of the worst chapter divisions of all the chapter divisions in the Bible. That should really be the end of verse 60, if, as far as I'm concerned, or maybe chapter 7, verse 61. And Saul approved of his execution, which has already been implied in verse 58. But again, Luke shows Saul not only it's not like he was forced to be the coat watcher or holder. He played a role in this and approved. He thought Stephen should die, just like everybody else that took part, which he will also talk about later on. And there arose that day, it says, a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. Well, how come it was just the church in Jerusalem? Because that was there was no other, the church was nowhere else yet. So, a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So this is, the persecution ramps up and really sets in. And Saul is the big player in this. He is the leader. He is the ringleader of the anti-church, anti-Christ movement. He's going in to people's homes. In fact, the way that it reads is almost like he was literally going to house after house to find people of this movement. And if they were there, he would drag them out and take them to prison. So, knock on the door. Are there any Christians in here? No? Yes? Yes? Okay, come with me. That. And then he'd go to the next house, next house, next house. It wasn't just him alone, because that would have taken forever. But he obviously had some of the Jews behind him. But what's interesting about this is that the purpose of this persecution, obviously, was to put an end to Christianity. Snuff it out, this movement. They tried to when Jesus was on the earth, failed. They killed Jesus. They thought they succeeded, failed after all, because now we put out the big fire. Now we got all kinds of little fires with his followers that are causing trouble and continuing the message that Jesus was preaching. Now they're really starting a movement to put an end to all these little fires. And what ended up happening was the exact opposite. So the effort to put an end to the church actually made the church grow and spread even more. It's kind of like depending on what kind of fire you're dealing with, you can't just pour water on it. Some fires you can. If you're burning some leaves, water will be a pretty good substance to use to put out that fire. But if you got some oil or grease or something on fire, you can't just throw water on it. And when you do, you're going to quickly realize that was not smart, because what happens? It's going to go up even more, at least for a second. So you're trying to put out the fire, but really you just fueled it even more. That's what happened here. Saul and his minions, I guess, are trying to snuff it out, but they're spreading it more and more, because what ended up happening is the Christians scattered abroad. They were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. They were, apparently, even those that had come for Pentecost, it seems that Luke is sort of hinting at the idea that the Christians were still hanging around Jerusalem. They didn't want to leave. Some of them may have gone home. I mean, it's only natural that some of them would have gone back. But as a rule, the Christians were still around in Jerusalem. But now, they were forced to scatter in Judea, which is where Jerusalem was, and even abroad to Samaria, which is what leads into the next situation. Yep.
Say, I would wish that I were not a Christian if the rest of my family were. I mean, that took a lot for him to say that.
Yeah.
So I think there was a deep love for Israel and for God. He just didn't know him.
Yeah, nobody was against Christianity more than the true, devout Jew. And that is just another reason why he was the perfect person for the Lord to pick to be who he ended up being. What more powerful example could there be of somebody to be the apostle to the Gentiles than this former Pharisee who is on record as being the leader of the anti-church movement? So, I mean, that alone demands a story to be told by this man. Like, why? How did you you were doing this and now you just flip-flopped? So he truly, there had been, we already learned from Gamaliel's mouth that there had been uprisings like this before. False Christs, false messiahs, and, just like they were against Jesus, some of the Jews may have been against them. Now, some of the historical uprisings, the Jews were behind them because they were against Rome. But some of them, they may, if it was they were perceived as being blasphemous or something, the Jews would have risen up against him just like Jesus. Well, Saul may not have been old enough to even been a part of that. He probably wasn't even alive. Or if he was alive for some smaller movement, he may have not have been old enough to take part. Now there is one that he could take part in. And because of his love for God, ironically, and the Israelite people, he's going to take part in this one. He's not going to let this one pass by. So he is truly thinking that he is doing God's will, because here is a false Messiah and uprising that needs to be put out. And I'm going to do everything I can. So his intentions were admirable. I am not going to let this pass by and me later in life say, I wish I would have taken part. He takes part. Simple as that. And we can't help but admire him because we've seen the end of it, and we know that as soon as he's corrected, that was all it took. He is a true truth seeker, because as soon as he learns that what he thought was the truth isn't the truth, and what he didn't think was the truth, he's still following the truth. More people need to be like that, other than the fact that he maybe could have taken a little bit more care in not being misled by this Jesus, not how he was actually the Christ after all. But it says, now those who were scattered went about preaching the word. When you pair that with verse 1, it's just amazing, because here this persecution arose and forced them to scatter. But when they scattered, they didn't go into hiding. That would be what a lot of people instinct would be, like, we need to lay low for a while. Not the Christians. They went around preaching the word, which is what got at least one person, not including Jesus, killed already. But that's what they went about doing. All the way even to Samaria. And Philip, the other of the 6 deacons that we read about, or basically deacons, effectively they were deacons. Stephen was the first one mentioned. He's been killed already. Philip was the second, the other one mentioned by name, the second one mentioned by name, I should say, because they were all 6, or 7 rather, mentioned by name. But Philip was the second one mentioned. He went to Samaria. Now, what's significant? Is this just a matter of fact, just a meaningless detail? No. There's significance behind Philip going to Samaria, because Jesus said earlier, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. Well, they started in Jerusalem, and it was brought up last week about a possible timeline. How far away from Pentecost are we? Well, I've seen a couple of different estimations. One of them is, 2 or 3 years, anywhere from 2 or 3 years to, maybe a maximum of 8 or 9 years, maybe. 7 or 8 years on the higher end of the spectrum, 2 or 3 years on the lower end of the spectrum, but it could be anywhere in between, or even less than that or more than that for all we know, but I think those are probably pretty safe estimations. So 5 years, we'll say, right there in the middle, just as a middle point. Now the gospel is leaving Jerusalem into Judea and even to Samaria. And for the Jews, that would also be significant. But remember what Philip was. Philip wasn't just a Christian and he wasn't just a Jew. What were those 7 men? Not deacons. I heard somebody say it. One of the words for it anyway. There's a few different words. The Hellenists, the Grecian Jews, which means they were not the Jewly Jews. They were the more outside Jews. The proselytes, maybe proselytes. I guess they could have been proselytes. They were kind of like proselytes in the sense that they weren't in Israel, some of them, but at least they were more spread out into the Greek culture, which is going to naturally make them more sympathetic to, I wouldn't even call it more sympathetic to Gentiles or Samaritans, but less stuck up against them. Because it's not that they were just more sympathetic like in a negative way, like they shouldn't have been sympathetic, but they were less inclusive or exclusive rather. And so it's significant that Philip is the one that went to Samaria because he wouldn't have had such misgivings about them in the first place, even if he wasn't changed by the gospel, which we know he was. And he's the one that went to Samaria and proclaimed to them the Christ. And so it began, the Great Commission. And the crowds with one accord paid attention to what was being said by Philip when they heard him and saw the signs that he did. Here's another spoken word confirmed by the signs, just like Mark 16:20. Here's the truth. Here's the signs that follow. So Mark 16:20, Acts 8:6. For unclean spirits, crying out with a loud voice, came out of many who had them, and many who were paralyzed or lame were healed. So there was much joy in that city. This is a very beautiful picture to follow up, the horrible picture of chapter 7, the end of chapter 7, and then the also horrible picture of the first part of chapter 8. Now, it's not stopped anything, has it? They are going, preaching, and even this one man, Philip, in Samaria. Look at the joy in this town of Samaria. It's like Jesus. It's like we're in the Gospels again. Jesus going through towns, healing people. Everybody's happy. It's amazing. All these crowds gathering. We're seeing that happen in Samaria. By the way, I forgot to mention that Acts 7:56 is the only time outside the Gospels that Jesus is called the Son of Man. Just a little tidbit if you're interested in that kind of thing. Jesus almost always called himself Son of Man, but outside the Gospels he's never called that except for Stephen when he calls him that in verse 56. So it's neither here nor there. It's just an interesting fact. So Philip's in Samaria. The gospel's spreading. It was successful in Jerusalem for the most part. It's spreading in Jerusalem. Now it's even in this new foreign territory in Samaria, the dirty, Samaritans that are no good for nothing, except to, insult God and be a disgrace to the whole human race as far as the Jews were concerned. Fertile soil for the gospel, it seems, here too. And it says the crowds with one accord paid attention to what was being said. And so much that there was a man, a certain infamous sorcerer, a notorious sorcerer, and I prefer the word sorcerer to magician because those two things are very different in our culture. A sorcerer and a magician. I don't even know if we have things that we would call sorcerers. As far as I'm concerned, people who claim to speak to the dead are the closest thing to sorcerers that I know of in our culture, and even they are not as prevalent maybe as they once were. How many of them does it take to be proven to be frauds before people start to think, maybe they're not talking to the dead after all. But this man was a sorcerer. But in practice, he was just what we would call a magician. He did tricks. The difference between a magician, this is just what I would characterize as the difference. A magician in our culture does not presume to have actual heavenly power. It's understood that they are doing a trick. Now, they don't tell their tricks. That's the rule. You're not supposed to tell your tricks. But it's understood that that's what it is. We may never understand how in the world they do it. But nobody, or I don't know of many magicians or any magicians anymore that are actually pretending that they have some sort of otherworldly power that nobody else has. It's just understood in a kind of an entertaining wow factor. But whenever you take those abilities, sleight of hand, almost all of it is sleight of hand, you take those skills and those abilities and you use them and presume to be somebody with otherworldly power, it becomes something different than just a magician that you would hire for a kid's birthday party or something like that, or go to a show somewhere on vacation where they, Penn and Teller or whoever else, these other magicians are. They're the only ones I can think of at the moment. But that's what Simon did, this man named Simon. He presumed to have the power of God. So he would do these kinds of things that tricked people, but people actually thought he had the power of God. That's what Luke says here. There was a man named Simon who had previously practiced magic in the city and amazed the people of Samaria, saying that he himself was somebody great. They all paid attention to him, from the least to the greatest, saying, "This man is the power of God that is called great." They paid attention to him because for a long time he had amazed them with his magic. So verse 9 seems to suggest he said he was somebody great. Verse 10 says they said he was somebody great. And they paid attention to him because he had been doing this for a long time. Everybody knew him. He really impressed people. But they thought that he had the power of God. Now, the reason that this is important is because what happens when Philip rolls into town? Now, this is Simon's turf. These people know Simon. They know that he has power, or believe he does. Philip's going to come in. It says, "But when they believed Philip as he preached good news about the kingdom of God in the name of Jesus Christ, they were baptized, both men and women. Even Simon himself believed, and after being baptized, he continued with Philip. And seeing signs and great miracles performed, he was amazed." Okay. Simon the sorcerer, Philip comes in, and you know what? Philip actually was doing things that were the power of God. Simon may have had tricks, and you see some of these TV evangelists, these faith healer type people, and there's people that come up to the front and they do some weird thing and knock them back, and it's all a sham. Every bit of it is a hoax. And I don't know if some of the people are so brainwashed that they actually think it's happening, or if they're all in on it, which is, I'm more inclined to think that. If it's televised, the people are all in on it because they can't afford for somebody to, not react. And they'll be like, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to happen. They're supposed to fall down, and then they're supposed to, get up and pretend like they never could walk before, but now they can, or whatever. Simon may have been so elaborate that he did things to trick people in that way, but I highly doubt he ever pretended to heal somebody that had been lame or paralyzed their whole life, or cast a demon out of somebody or anything like that. But Philip comes in doing those kinds of things, and everybody, it's like, whoa. You know, I could do like a little magic trick that I learned maybe, and it's not really that impressive, especially when you don't reveal it. But then if somebody else comes in and does something that's just mind-blowing, it makes my little magic trick look kind of stupid, you know. So that's kind of what's going on here. Philip came, he's doing actual things that could not be explained in any way. Simon, so much so that Simon even believes. Because he saw, you know, he knew all along that, you know, his was art, you know, these secret arts. He's doing these tricks. Now he sees somebody that's doing real things, real miracles. And that helped him believe. It's a good example of why the signs were also powerful, not just to confirm the word, but also could help a man like Simon come around. He may not have believed Philip just preaching, but when he saw what he did, that made him pay attention to what Philip said, just like it says in verse earlier about Philip. He proclaimed to them the Christ, and they all paid attention to what was being said when they heard him and saw the signs. So that happened here in Simon's town as well. And Simon also believed. One thing I want to point out before we're out of time, or as we're out of time, we won't finish this part. But Simon believed and was baptized in the exact same way that everybody else there was. There are people who say they don't know what to do with Simon, because if you believe that once you're saved you can't be lost, or you can't even have the chance of being lost, they conclude Simon must not have really believed. He wasn't really saved. The reason that he was in jeopardy later down in the chapter is because he wasn't really saved. Well, who am I to say he wasn't saved? Looks to me like he did exactly what everybody else did. And how can I say he wasn't saved, but everybody else was? Verse 12, they believed Philip and were baptized. That means they were saved. Simon also believed and was baptized. Luke is very careful to point out, Simon did exactly what they did. He actually believed Philip, and he was baptized upon that belief, and then he continued with Philip. It doesn't even say any of the other people continued with Philip, actually continued with Philip. Now we might say he would just continue with Philip because he was amazed by what he did. That may be true, but he still continued with Philip. He still was going with Philip and had been baptized as a result of believing in what Philip was preaching, which was Christ. So Simon believed him, believed in Jesus, and was baptized for the remission of his sins, at which point he was added to the church, and he continued with Philip. And Lord willing, next week we'll see how that unfolded, because Simon the sorcerer is a good example of somebody who, you know, even though you're saved, even though you believe in the gospel, you're still you. And the things that tempted you before you were baptized are going to tempt you after you're baptized. And it's easy, if we're not careful, it's easy to let the old self come back up and take over. And that's, sadly, for Simon, what is going to happen with him. And Peter's going to help him come out of that.